Roberto had loved Rosary since the first time that she walked into his classroom. Her long, raven-coloured hair had a life of its own, and it swished softly from side to side as she entered the room. From behind her hair, dark eyes stared into the room, and they locked onto Roberto. It was like no one else existed, except for him. Roberto's mouth became dry, and out of reflex he swallowed hard. It was painful. It felt like grains of sand were tumbling down his throat. They tore at him as he wanted to cough from anxiety. This girl floated down the rows of tables, her feet moving in small, graceful steps. She reached the chair next to Roberto. Her delicate hand reached out, pulling the chair out. Roberto felt his heart rising in his cheeks, and he was sure that he was beet red. "Hi, my name's Rosary," she cooed in a voice sweeter than any honey Roberto had ever tasted. It was at this moment he knew he was in love. Soon enough, they were dating. Roberto idolized Rosary. She was his angel. The romance blossomed throughout high school until they graduated. Soon after, Roberto proposed. Roberto was ecstatic when Rosary accepted, but he knew there was a problem, and it was a very big problem. He couldn't afford to pay for the wedding, and he didn't even own anything that he could use to serve the guests. He came from a poor family, and his parents had worked hard to send him to school. Roberto worked hard at school and promised he would pay his family back, but how was he going to pay for the wedding? Roberto was at his wit end. He sat outside his parents' small wooden home. The slats of bamboo decorated the outside, but they did little to keep the weather or the mosquitoes out. In the distance, he could make out the outline of one of the great mountains, and suddenly he remembered there was an Encanto that lived in that place. When the sun started rising over the horizon, he knew it was time to depart. He pulled out his backpack. It felt empty. He could only take a bottle of water with him. He couldn't even afford to take rice. The path was long and dangerous, but for Rosary, he would do anything. He'd already been walking for several hours. The sun was blistering hot. He pulled off his shirt and wrapped it around his head in an attempt to shield him from the heat. As he walked, the rocks changed from smooth pebbles to slivers of stone that cut into his rubber slippers. Soon the straps began to break and the soles were gone. Roberto's bare feet succumbed to the razor-sharp rocks. Each step was agony, but he had to make it up the mountain. How could he look at Rosary if he didn't find the Encanto? The path wound its way up the mountain. The trees soon started to disappear. They too were afraid of the trail. He turned a corner and Roberto let out a gasp of pleasure. There was a small cave in front of him. 3 tiny birds were pecking at the grass. Their small brown feathers were almost the same colour as the dirt, and in unison, the birds stopped pecking the ground. Their little black eyes started to stare at Roberto. They didn't move. They were perfectly still, but their feathers were ruffled by the wind, almost dancing with an unseen partner. Roberto was unsure what to do. He stood there in silence. "Come closer," a voice came from the cave. It sounded like a young child. Step after shaky step, Roberto approached the birds and the dark cave. With a flutter of feathers, the birds leapt into the air, their wings frosting the air beneath them as they headed into the blue sky. The cave was a perfect size for Roberto as he entered. It seemed that the mountain had been carved just for him. The cold walls pressed against his body as he could feel the heat being sucked from him. "Who's there?" a small childish voice whispered. Roberto stopped, too frightened to move. A sickening feeling started to rise up deep inside. He could feel his stomach beginning to twist and turn in pain. "Why are you here? Speak now or else." No breath would come to Roberto. His chest started to squeeze tight, and something was pressing its weight against his body. In a panic, he managed to whisper his name into the darkness. "Roberto, You're here because of someone you love, right? That's why you came to see me. I haven't had a guest in such a long time. The voice giggled as the crushing weight fled his body. I am here because I am in love, and I want to give my wife the best wedding I can. But I'm poor, and I can't even afford to feed my guests. And even if I had food, I have nothing to serve them with. Please, dear fairy, please help me, Roberto pleaded. Nothingness was all that he could feel. It was oppressive. Roberto was afraid that he had offended the Encanto. It was initially subtle, a pale, amber glow, but it became stronger as time slipped through Roberto's hands. As the light intensified, a woman's figure emerged from the darkness. Her skin was the colour of honey. Her almond eyes were a pale shade of hazel. Her long brown hair covered her bare skin and curves. Small, seductive lips started speaking to Roberto. It took all his willpower not to run towards the woman. Her beauty was like no other. Very well, I'll help you. Take these gifts to use. The food will appear on the day of the wedding. But you must return what you borrowed to me within 7 days. Now come forward. Take my hand. The voice was now kind and full of sympathy. The wave of fear that had been drowning Roberto since he entered the cave suddenly lifted. The Encanto took Roberto's hand, leading him deeper into the cave. Her hand was soft and warm. It reminded him of Rosary's hand. The fairy stopped and pointed. Roberto couldn't believe his eyes. In the middle of the room, there was a small wooden table, decorated with a fine red silk tablecloth. Resting on the table was a pile of fine white porcelain plates, inlaid with golden trim in the shape of palm leaves. Silver knives, forks, spoons, and all sorts of cooking utensils were all there, waiting for Roberto. As the Encanto promised, on the day of the wedding, Roberto asked everyone to leave as he set the plates on the table. Each time he turned away and turned back, food appeared on the plate. Pork, chicken, beef, seafood, and everything Roberto couldn't afford to buy. Roberto and Rosary were married. Roberto and Rosary were married in a beautiful Roman Catholic church. Pictures of the saints watched on high above the couple, giving their blessing. After the ceremony, the bride and groom continued the celebration in their new home. The following day, Roberto started cleaning and packing the gifts from the Encanto. He was prepared for the long journey back to the cave. Rosary stirred, wiping the sleep from her eyes. "What are you doing, my love?" she asked, still half asleep. "Mahal, I borrowed all these plates and utensils. I need to return them," he said as he looked towards his beautiful wife. Rosary stared at him for a moment and cast her eyes over the plates, and for the first time, Roberto saw something in his eyes he had never seen before. Greed. "Love, maybe we can borrow them a little bit longer. It'd be a shame for you to take them back now. You should return to bed now. You can take them back tomorrow." Every day, Rosary would always find another excuse not to let Roberto return the items to the Encanto. 8 days had passed since Roberto borrowed them from the Encanto. Roberto awoke and attempted to get out of bed. He found he couldn't move. A heavy weight was on his chest and it pinned him to the bed. It felt like it did back in the cave. Fear rose up inside him. He knew the Encanto was there. "I told you 7 days, didn't I?" A childish voice whispered into his ear, causing a shiver to run through his entire body. "But I was going to return them today," Roberto attempted to say, but his words wouldn't come out. "Liar. You wanted to keep them." "No, she wanted to keep them." Now it is time to pay the price, the little voice laughed. And with that, the weight on Roberto's chest vanished as suddenly as it came. Turning towards Rosary, she was still sleeping soundly. Her long, black hair was resting on her chest, rising and falling as she breathed in deeply. He admired his new wife asleep and prayed silently nothing evil would happen to her. As Roberto looked closer at her, he saw some strands of grey hair intermixed with the raven black. Had they always been there? Slipping out of bed, he went to the room where the gifts from the Encanto were. The fine plates and the beautiful silverware were now gone, and there was a pile of stones where the items had been. A shrill scream broke Roberto out of his haze. He turned where the scream had come from, his bedroom. He didn't remember running to the room, but he was standing at the foot of the bed, staring at Rosary. She was sitting up in the bed, holding large chunks of jet black hair. The strands fell between her fingers onto the bed. Rosary's hair had all fallen out. It was gone. Rosary's eyes were stained red and bloodshot, and the tears flowed down her cheeks. "What's happening to me?" she screamed. Roberto stood in silence. No words came to mind. "You did this, didn't you? You did this to me. Why? I hate you!" Rosary's words struck Roberto. He'd never heard such venom from anyone. "It wasn't me. It was the fairy. I borrowed things from her. I knew I should have returned them," Roberto mumbled. "Fairy? What fairy? Liar!" Rosary screamed at him. With a flick of Rosary's wrist, the sheet covering her flew across the room, along with the hair. Roberto's eyes were instantly drawn to Rosary's legs. They were covered in red splotches and lesions. When she saw them, she screamed again. Roberto called for the alberero to come and treat Rosary, but the faith healer couldn't do anything to help. It was a powerful curse that had befallen her. As the days passed, Rosary's condition worsened. Her skin started to wither and flake. She could no longer leave the bed. Her condition worsened by the day. Roberto begged forgiveness from the Encanto, but she would not answer his calls. Eventually, Rosary lost her battle with the Encanto, and she slipped into nothingness. Well, dear listener, did you learn a lesson from poor Roberto and Rosary? You should always keep your promises to the spirits and fairies. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's lullaby. If you enjoy my content, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember, dear viewer, keep watching for what's in the dark.